I want to tell this story carefully because for many people in America, it is not a story at all. It is a memory. I am telling it as someone who stood close enough to watch what happens when illness meets paperwork and compassion meets policy. Her name was Margaret. She was 62 years old when everything began to unravel. Not with pain, not with fear, but with a letter. Margaret had done everything right, at least by the standards she was taught to believe in. She worked for over 40 years, paid her taxes, kept her credit clean, never asked for help. She believed responsibility protected you. That belief is common and dangerous. Margaret worked as an administrative assistant at a mid-size manufacturing company in Ohio. Not glamorous, not high-paying, but steady. She had health insurance through her employer, basic coverage, high deductible. She never questioned it. She rarely needed it. Then one afternoon, she felt dizzy at work. Nothing dramatic, just enough to scare her. A coworker insisted she see a doctor. Margaret resisted at first. Doctor visits, she knew, were never just doctor visits. They were bills waiting to happen. But she went. The initial appointment seemed harmless, routine tests, blood work. The doctor frowned slightly, ordered more tests, then more. Margaret received the first bill before she received a diagnosis. She stared at the numbers, convinced there had been a mistake. She called the insurance company. After 47 minutes on hold, a polite voice explained that the charges were applied to her deductible. Margaret nodded as if the voice could see her. She didn't fully understand what that meant. She would soon. The diagnosis arrived quietly. Early-stage cancer. Treatable, the doctor said. Manageable, the pamphlet said. But the bills told a different story. Margaret continued working through treatment. She used vacation days for appointments, sick days for recovery. She didn't want to lose her job. She needed the insurance. The irony was not lost on her. As the treatments continued, so did the mail. Envelope after envelope, hospital charges, lab fees, out-of-network adjustments. She began organizing them by date. That stack grew faster than her strength returned. Margaret called her insurance provider again and again. Each time she spoke to a different person. Each time she explained her situation from the beginning. Each time she was told the same thing. This is how your plan works. There was no cruelty in their voices, just indifference. Illness, Margaret learned, does not make you special in a system built for efficiency. It makes you expensive. By the third month, Margaret had exhausted her savings. By the fourth, she began using credit cards, not for luxuries, for survival. She skipped meals sometimes, not out of hunger, out of fear of the next envelope. Her daughter, Lisa, noticed the change, the fatigue, the silence. Margaret insisted everything was fine. Women of her generation were taught that complaining was weakness. One evening, Lisa found the letters, spread across the kitchen table. She read them slowly. Then she looked at her mother and asked the question Margaret had been avoiding. "How much do you owe?" Margaret hesitated. That hesitation said enough. Lisa offered to help. Margaret refused. She didn't want to be a burden. That word had guided her entire life. Burden. But the system had no problem burdening her. When Margaret finally missed a payment, the tone of the letters changed. They were no longer informational. They were threatening. Late fees, collections, credit impact. None of them asked how she was feeling. None of them asked if she was scared. Margaret felt herself shrinking, not physically, existentially. She began questioning every decision, every appointment, every treatment. Was survival worth the cost? That was the question the system never answered. And that was when something inside Margaret shifted, not into anger, into clarity. She realized she had been trying to survive quietly in a system that only noticed noise. That realization would change everything. Margaret did not tell anyone when the first collection call came. The phone rang in the middle of the afternoon, and she almost didn't answer it. Something in her already knew. The voice on the other end was polite, almost friendly. That, somehow, made it worse. They asked her to confirm her identity. Then they explained that her account was past due, that payment arrangements could be discussed. Margaret listened quietly, her hand resting on the kitchen counter for balance. She said she was undergoing treatment. She said she was doing her best. The voice acknowledged her situation and returned immediately to numbers. There was no space for fear in the conversation, only options. Margaret agreed to a payment plan she knew she could not keep. After the call ended, she sat down and cried for the first time since her diagnosis, not because of the cancer, because of the math. Over the next weeks, the calls multiplied, different numbers, different companies. Some left messages, some didn't. They all spoke the same language: urgency, consequences, deadlines. Margaret began screening her calls, letting unknown numbers ring until silence returned. Her world grew smaller: appointments, work, home. Everything else felt dangerous. Lisa continued to offer help. She suggested financial counseling, patient advocacy groups, charity programs. Margaret listened politely and said no. She didn't trust systems anymore. They all seemed to come with conditions. One evening, after a particularly exhausting treatment session, Margaret collapsed onto her couch and fell asleep with the television on. She woke up hours later to a commercial, a smiling family, a voice promising peace of mind, health insurance. Margaret laughed out loud. It startled her. She hadn't laughed in weeks. The sound felt unfamiliar. That night, she made a decision she had resisted for months. She asked for help, not from her family, from strangers. Lisa helped her research patient advocacy organizations, not affiliated with hospitals, not funded by insurers, independent. The first advocate Margaret spoke to listened differently. She asked questions about Margaret's health, then about her finances, then about her insurance plan. She explained things no one else had taken the time to explain: out-of-network billing, coding errors, appeal rights. Margaret learned that some of her charges were not final, they were negotiable. That word changed everything: negotiable. No one had ever used it before. Together, they began calling hospitals and billing departments. Some calls ended quickly. This is standard procedure. Others required patience, hours on hold, transferred calls, repetition. Margaret let the advocate speak. She listened. She learned. For the first time since her diagnosis, she felt involved instead of managed. They discovered errors, duplicate charges, incorrect codes, small mistakes that carried large consequences. Some bills were reduced, others dismissed entirely. Not all, but enough. Enough to breathe again. Meanwhile, Margaret's health fluctuated. Good days, bad days. She continued working as long as she could, but eventually her body made the decision for her. Her employer called her into a meeting. They spoke gently about her performance, about her absences. They reminded her of company policy. Margaret nodded. She had expected this. She asked about her insurance. They explained her options. COBRA. The numbers made her dizzy. Continuing coverage would cost more than her rent. She thanked them and left. That was the day Margaret realized something fundamental. Health insurance in America is not designed to follow you when you are most vulnerable. It is designed to follow employment. She applied for disability benefits. The paperwork was overwhelming. Pages of forms, medical documentation, deadlines. She filled them out slowly, carefully. She mailed everything and waited. Months passed. Bills continued. Collection letters arrived again, though fewer now. The advocate helped where she could, but systems move slowly. Illness does not. One afternoon, Margaret received a letter from Social Security. Her application was denied, not because she wasn't sick enough, because she hadn't proven it the right way. Lisa was furious. Margaret was tired. She appealed. More paperwork, more waiting. Margaret's world narrowed further, but something inside her had changed. She was no longer ashamed. She spoke openly about her situation at her support group. Others shared similar stories, different illnesses, same outcomes, medical debt, insurance confusion, fear. Margaret realized she was not failing. She was surviving a broken system. That understanding gave her strength she didn't know she still had. She began helping others navigate their bills, sharing resources, explaining what she had learned. It felt strange, becoming knowledgeable in something she never wanted to understand, but it mattered. Eventually, the appeal was approved. Disability benefits began, modest but reliable. Medicare coverage followed. The financial pressure eased, not disappeared, but softened. Margaret still had debt, still had scars, but she had reclaimed something far more important: dignity. Years later, when Margaret looked back on that time, she didn't remember the exact numbers. She remembered the fear of envelopes, the sound of the phone ringing, and the moment she realized she did not have to face it alone. Her illness went into remission. Her finances never fully recovered, but she did. When people asked her what the hardest part had been, she didn't mention cancer. She said this: being sick was frightening. Being invisible was worse. Margaret learned that in America, survival is not just about health. It is about persistence, about learning the language of systems that were never built to be kind, and about knowing when to ask for help, even when pride tells you not to. That was the lesson she carried forward, and the reason her story still matters. After Margaret's benefits were finally approved, something unexpected happened. The silence arrived. Not the peaceful kind, the unfamiliar kind. For months, her life had been filled with forms, calls, deadlines, and fear. Every day had demanded action. Now, for the first time in a long while, there was nothing urgent waiting for her. No envelope on the counter, no voicemail blinking on her phone, just time. Margaret didn't know what to do with it at first. She sat at her kitchen table and stared out the window, watching people go about their lives as if nothing had changed. And that was the strangest part. The world had not paused when hers nearly collapsed. It had kept moving. She began volunteering more regularly at the support group that had helped her through the worst months, not as a speaker, not as a leader, just as someone willing to listen. People came with folders thick with paper, bills, denial letters, explanations that explained nothing. Margaret recognized the look in their eyes immediately, the mix of fear and embarrassment. She would sit with them quietly and say something simple. You're not failing, you're navigating something that was never designed to be clear. Those words mattered more than advice, because shame isolates faster than illness ever could. One afternoon, a man about her age sat across from her with trembling hands. He had worked construction most of his life, paid cash for everything, avoided doctors unless absolutely necessary. A heart attack changed that. Now he was drowning in debt he didn't understand. Margaret didn't have answers for everything, but she had patience. She showed him how to ask questions without apologizing, how to request itemized bills, how to appeal. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Word spread quietly. Not through ads, not through organizations, through conversations. Margaret became someone people recommended to each other, not because she had power, but because she had survived. Meanwhile, her own health required constant attention. Remission did not mean freedom. It meant monitoring, follow-ups, uncertainty. She learned to live with that uncertainty instead of fighting it. Some days were heavy, others surprisingly light. She stopped planning far ahead. She planned for what mattered: time with her daughter, short walks, simple meals. One evening, while sorting old paperwork she no longer needed, Margaret found the very first bill she had received, the one that had arrived before her diagnosis. She held it for a long time. The numbers no longer scared her. What frightened her now was how close she had come to believing she was the problem, that she had done something wrong. That belief, she realized, was the most dangerous part of the system, not the debt, not the illness, the quiet suggestion that needing help was a personal failure. Margaret tore the bill in half and threw it away. It felt symbolic, necessary. Her daughter Lisa noticed the change in her mother, not just physical. Margaret stood differently now, spoke differently. She no longer minimized her experiences. When people asked how she was doing, she answered honestly. "I'm managing," she would say, "and that's enough." Lisa once asked if Margaret wished she had known earlier what she knew now. Margaret thought about it, then said, "I wish I had known I was allowed to ask questions. That permission alone could have changed everything." As time passed, Margaret's story began reaching people she would never meet. A local journalist attended one of the support meetings and wrote a small piece about medical debt and patient advocacy. Margaret's name was not mentioned. That was intentional. She didn't want recognition. She wanted visibility for the issue. The article sparked conversations, letters, emails. Some people thanked the writer. Others shared their own stories. Different states, same patterns. Margaret read them slowly. She was not surprised. She was saddened, but she was no longer alone. One morning she received a letter from the insurance company. Not a bill, an explanation of benefits. She laughed softly when she opened it. Old habits die slowly. The letter meant nothing now. Its power over her was gone. Margaret had learned something that could not be taken back. Systems lose their grip when you understand how they work, and when they don't work, understanding that it is not your fault is an act of resistance. Her life settled into something quieter than she had ever imagined. Not smaller, just clearer. She didn't chase happiness. She protected peace. When new people joined the support group, she always said the same thing before they spoke. "Take your time," she would say. "There's no rush here." Those words mattered because illness teaches you that time is precious, but healing teaches you that it doesn't need to be hurried. Years later, Margaret looked back on the period she once thought had broken her. It hadn't. It had stripped away illusions. The illusion that responsibility guarantees protection. The illusion that systems are neutral. The illusion that silence keeps you safe. She had survived cancer, but more importantly, she had survived invisibility. When people asked her what she would change if she could, she smiled gently. "I would have asked questions sooner and forgiven myself faster." Margaret never became wealthy. She never fully escaped the financial consequences of her illness, but she reclaimed something far more valuable: her voice. And once you find that, no system can take it from you again. As Margaret grew older, she stopped measuring her life by what she had lost. That took time. At first, every quiet moment reminded her of what had been taken: her savings, her sense of security, the belief that doing everything right would protect her. But slowly, something shifted. She began to notice what remained. Her mornings were no longer ruled by fear. Her phone no longer triggered anxiety. Her mailbox was just a mailbox again. Margaret learned that peace does not arrive all at once. It arrives in small, ordinary moments. A cup of tea that stays warm long enough to finish, a walk without checking the time, a conversation where no one is asking for explanations. She became selective about where she placed her energy. Some friendships faded, others deepened. She stopped attending gatherings where people spoke confidently about systems they had never been trapped inside. Instead, she gravitated toward people who listened, people who understood that survival is not always heroic. Sometimes it is simply persistent. Margaret continued volunteering, though less frequently now. She knew when to step back. She trusted others to carry the work forward. That trust mattered, because one of the hardest lessons she had learned was this: you don't need to fix everything to make a difference. You only need to be present when it matters. One afternoon, a woman at the support group asked Margaret a question that stayed with her. How did you keep going when it felt like everything was stacked against you? Margaret thought carefully before answering. Then she said, I stopped trying to be strong in the way the world expects. I focused on being honest instead. Honesty had saved her. Not optimism, not positivity. Honesty. About fear, about limits, about what she could and could not carry. That honesty had opened doors she didn't know existed. Years passed. Margaret's health remained stable, though never guaranteed. She learned to live alongside uncertainty rather than fight it. She planned modestly. She hoped realistically. She forgave herself for the years she had spent believing silence was safety. One day, while organizing old photographs, she found a picture of herself taken shortly before her diagnosis. She studied it quietly. The woman in the photo looked familiar, but distant. Someone who trusted systems more than her own instincts. She smiled softly, not with regret, with compassion. That woman had done the best she could with what she knew, and that was enough. As Margaret's story traveled quietly through conversations and shared experiences, she never framed it as a warning. She framed it as permission. Permission to ask questions, permission to challenge decisions, permission to say, I don't understand, without shame. Because in America, too many people confuse confusion with incompetence. Margaret knew better now. Confusion is often the first sign that something is wrong, not with you, but with the system you are navigating. When people asked her what she wished policymakers understood, she answered simply, that illness doesn't wait for approval and dignity shouldn't depend on paperwork. She didn't expect change overnight. She had lived long enough to know better, but she believed in something quieter. That stories, when told honestly, have a way of lingering, of reshaping how people see what they once accepted as normal. Margaret never called herself an activist. She was simply a woman who refused to disappear quietly, and that refusal mattered. In the end, Margaret's life was not defined by cancer, nor by debt, nor by the system that failed her. It was defined by the moment she realized she was allowed to take up space, even when she was tired, even when she was afraid, even when she needed help, especially then. Because survival is not just about staying alive, it is about staying visible. And once you understand that, the system no longer gets the final word.